So I've been using 3D roughly for almost 5 years now, but the first 3 years of my life with 3D wasn't like the very best because I didn't really know what I was doing. At that time, I was only using Maya because I was trying to become a 3D artist. And then after that, I was like, hey, I think I want to get into animation. And then towards the end of my degree, I realized that, hey, I enjoy concepting and I like drawing, so I'm gonna be a concept artist. And that's also the time when COVID was happening, and so we were all stuck in our houses. And during that time period also, most of the concept works for The Last of Us 2 came out. And that's when I actually saw that you can actually use these 3D techniques to make really cool looking environment designs. And that's when I decided that, hey, I wanna learn a little bit more. I wanna get out there, experiment a little bit more. And the one thing that I found out is that a lot of these concept artists, they were using Blender for their workflow. And so it's been almost 2 years since I've started using Blender. And then towards the end of last year, I started learning 3D code. So today I'm gonna share with you guys how 3D helped me become a much better artist. Because before learning 3D, there were just so many things that I was struggling with. I was struggling with perspective, color, lighting, texturing, all the fundamentals, right? And I feel like when I learned 3D, it kind of helped me understand those fundamentals a little bit more and made me a much better artist. Now, I by no means am a professional 3D artist. It's just a tool that I use to come up with ideas, come up with good images, because that's what matters to me, a final image. And I also don't want to spend too much time working on an image. Now, one of the things that I'm really gonna... Now, first things first, the very first thing that really helped me when I was learning 3D is the fact that I can see my models from like different perspectives, from different views, from different angles, something that's very important when you're working as a concept artist. Because let's say I could be making a prop up here, but then I need to reiterate and show like how it looks like from the front view, side view, top view, back view, bottom view, whatever views you got up there, right? Whatever your art director wants you to make. And this is where I feel like 3D is so helpful, because you can just right off the bat get you can just use a cube or something, right? And right off the bat, you can get like all these different angles. And what it does, you also start thinking like a 3D artist. So you start thinking about the things that a 3D artist might need when your concepts are passed down to the 3D team. So for the most part, what I usually do is I sculpt out my focal point using 3D code. By focal point, I mean, let's say if I'm making an environment where there's this structure or this prop that's going to be like the main focus of the piece, I want to make sure I spend some good time detailing it and not worry too much about the fundamentals of just modeling stuff. And that's where I feel like 3D code is so powerful, because you can literally, I would just say the best way to explain it is it's like Photoshop in 3D, because you're not dealing with any polys, everything is voxel, so you can literally just paint in 3D. And I will definitely go over this in a different video where I'll break down my whole 3D code process. But that's what I like to do for my main focal points, or at least for the stuff that I know is going to be complicated to model in Blender. But for the most part, when it comes to Blender, like I'll use Blender for the rest of the scene, the walls, the floors, the ceiling, the room, and all those more hard surface looking things, because Blender is a lot better for that. But then again, it's a case by case, right? At the end of the day, trying to figure out which works the best. The second most thing that I feel like 3D taught me is that you get to know your limitations. Your limitations as someone who's using 3D as a tool to make these cool designs. There are going to be moments where it's going to be so easy to add a lot of details, and there are going to be moments where it's going to be so hard to add a lot of details. And on the first one, where you're constantly adding details, sometimes it can be very easy. For example, if you're doing like a sci-fi environment, like I'm doing right now, I could model out pipes and vents and just scatter them all over the place and get really quick detail. But if I don't have areas of rest in my design, there's not really a clear focal point. So you constantly have to think about your big, medium, small shapes and your rule of thirds when you're designing in 3D. On the other hand, sometimes you want to make something so complex that it's going to be so hard to model it. So that's also where you get stuck. So, and these are the things that you only experience once you get to know how to do 3D. And also, going back to the first point, it also makes you realize that, hey, this concept is going to be eventually going to be passed down to a 3D artist. So like you want to make sure that easier for them to also model this thing out. Like, is it really that necessary to add so much detail, like if it doesn't have any function? Number 3, lighting and texturing. My favorite part. Actually, it wasn't my favorite part in the beginning because it's a little weird in the beginning when you're learning how to do all that. But for someone who does not have a lot of experience just exploring lighting in digital painting in general, using 3D can be a really good source for referencing, just for simple lighting. Hey, I can just throw a spotlight up here and see where the shadows are casting, or hey, I can have like a sun and rotate it and kind of simulate where I want my light to be. To take it even a step further, you can use HDRIs, which is light information from an image that lights up your entire scene. So all these tools make everything so much faster and it looks believable at the same time. And when you pair that up with texturing, you can figure out how light's going to react with different textures. And you also start thinking about the different materials that your props are made of. Like you start thinking about, okay, so for example, wood. How does wood react with light? Will it react the same way as metal? Probably not, because it's a different material, right? So it just becomes a lot more easier to some extent studying these little changes, and it could be a really good reference for just painting in general. And from there you can obviously from there you can take your fully rendered textured models from Blender to Photoshop and you can just paint on top of them. I mean, there are moments where I would have really weird looking textures, but I do have like the basic lighting information on top of it. And if it's way too noisy, I can always bring it to Photoshop, paint on top of it, remove some of the noise. Or if it's way too plain, I can just photo bash some textures on top of it. So it just depends for the most part what you're working on. But I do think lighting and texturing plays a very important role when it comes to learning 3D and using that knowledge, using those resources to make a nice and compelling image. And also that something that you can get in, the detailing that you can get in is like really fast and really quickly. That way, the one thing that I mostly try to do is that if I'm building something in 3D, I'll make sure I texture it to some extent. Because if I'm going through the trouble of already doing it in 3D, I might as well just do everything in 3D. And then that way it's easier for me to do a little paint over in Photoshop. And the best part is that I can always get like different angles and the texture is still up there. It's not like I have to photo bash the texture constantly from different angles, provided I do a lot of texturing in Blender. And stay tuned to my channel. I will go over some tutorials on Blender and 3D code, different lighting techniques, texturing techniques. I have a lot of content planned out for you guys. So if you've made it this far and you haven't subscribed, so hit the subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. The next one is that there's always room to grow. When you start learning 3D, right, the journey kind of starts off with you just doing very simple basic modeling, and then you take one step further where you start playing around with lighting, and then you take it another step further where you start playing with different textures and then you render it. And then from there you can add fog, you can add particles, do all kinds of cool stuff, right? So there's always going to be a moment where you'll feel like you haven't learned anything, if that makes sense. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that there's always so much out there for you to learn, right? There's so many softwares out there. There's so many techniques out there, and stuff like this in general, like all this technology just excites me as an artist. Like the next thing that I want to try out is sculpting in VR, because that's something that looks really cool and it looks very intuitive, right? So there's so many tools out there, and I feel like once you get into that learning space, you're constantly in a state of constantly learning stuff and constantly learning these new tools out there, which in a way also makes you more efficient and more dependable, because you start learning techniques that'll get you from point A to point B in a much less amount of time. So that's what it does, right? When you're you always have to keep an open mind about these different tools, different technologies. If you think about it, right, before digital art was a thing, you know, people were only doing everything traditional, and then digital art came along, so people were just like painting everything. And then the concept of photo bashing came along, so then people started photo bashing, and then the concept of 3D came out, so now people do 3D and then photo bash and then paint. And so we don't know what the next thing is going to be. I mean, there's AI art now, but I don't know how that's going to end up. But other than that, when you start exploring more more things artistically, technology wise, it opens up doors for you. And the other thing that it does also is that, let's say you learn all this 3D, right? But then later on you realize that, hey, I don't want to do concept work anymore. I want to be more of a 3D artist. So it's going to be very easy for you to like make that transition because you already are familiar to those concepts from the very beginning. And so, yeah, it makes you more versatile. So the last and final thing that 3D taught me was that how much I suck at 2D painting, you guys. Oh my God. Like, you have no idea. Like, I'll be looking at my older stuff and I'm just like, shit, dude, you suck. And many times what happens is that sometimes I would have like a fully rendered scene, do a paint tour and everything, and I would just stare at it and be like, I could never do this without 3D. But which is also why I really want to emphasize the fact that even though we have all these shortcuts available to us now, it's still very important that you keep practicing your fundamentals. Now, for me personally, what happened was that I ignored my fundamentals for the longest time. I took the easy way out. I just started doing 3D. And what happened was when I was done rendering stuff, and when I took it to Photoshop to do a paint tour, I did not know what to do with it because I wasn't sure how to like punch up my lighting or how to like create a proper focal point or how to have like a proper value structure. So even though you have all these tools available to you, you constantly want to keep practicing your fundamentals as well. For me personally, I'm an environment artist. I focus on environments. So the things that I'm going to focus on is, composition, value, color. Yeah, for the most part, I would start with these three, right? And when it comes to like practicing those fundamentals, it's either you do studies or you just do a lot of 2D painting. Somehow try to like mix and merge those two techniques. Like for example, like I have this image up here. This is what the 3D render looks like, and then this was the final image. So if I just turn in this 3D rendered piece on my portfolio, like when people look at it, they're gonna be like, yo, he doesn't know how to paint. So you need to have like some skills, like some 2D knowledge to make sure your 3D gets elevated to an even higher level. Wow, that was cool. And then the other piece that I'm working on right now, I mean, the final render looked something like this, but then, the final render from Blender looked like this, and then the paint tour just made it look even better because, I added those little highlights, little atmosphere, a little bit of particles and fog. So you never want to neglect your 2D skills. You want to like, if there are certain things that I feel like I can easily fix in Photoshop, I would do it. Like when it comes to mixing textures in Blender, that's something that I'm not very comfortable doing. So what I usually do sometimes, let's say I have a rock, right? And I want some grass on a rock. So instead of having some complex node system where I have these two textures mixing each other, I'll render the rock with the rock texture, and then I'll render it with the grass texture, and then I'll just mask it in Photoshop and, paint and take away stuff. So you kind of have to figure out your sweet spot. You kind of have to figure out what works for you individually as an artist. But the main idea of this video is to kind of show you that there are studios, there are companies out there who value the 3D knowledge a lot these days. It also depends on what you're going for. If you're going for something more stylized, then maybe not, maybe to some extent. If you're going for something more photorealistic, then you definitely want some sort of 3D knowledge because it's just so much more faster. Like you can't just be like pumping out photorealistic concepts without using 3D, and it won't be very efficient. I mean, if you're really good at photo bashing, sure, go for it. But even the best of the best people are like using 3D for the most part. And having that basic, nice 2D knowledge will only make your concepts look so much better in 3D. So you want to always focus on your fundamentals, never ignore those, and just take everything together, and baby steps. So this last part, I want to give a little advice on if you're someone who has never touched 3D, if you're someone who has never used it before, where do you get started? Like how do you start building stuff in 3D? What's the best way to learn? For me personally, I honestly think you should go into it with a goal in mind, and it doesn't have to be anything crazy, right? Like for me, it was, okay, I want to make photorealistic environments. So I'm going to look up tutorials where people are building environments that are photorealistic. And yeah, that's a good place to start. And because what happens is that I'll learn the techniques that I need to build a cool looking environment, and I'll also be learning how to build stuff in 3D. So it's like, it's a lot more efficient that way. With that being said, it's also nice to have a basic knowledge of the software in general. I mean, we've got Blender Guru and CG Boost. I looked up their tutorials. They're pretty good. And the best part is that all of their videos are like in different parts. So you don't have to like go at it in just one go. You can just like distribute it, do a little bit each day. And it's also free. So that's a good thing about Blender. Blender is open source, so there's so many tutorials out there. Like you would look for like the most weirdest thing out there, and there would be a tutorial for it. So that's the good thing about Blender. Something that I did not have when I was learning Maya, and also that's something that I also struggle with when I'm building stuff in 3D code. There aren't that many tutorials out there, so I have to just kind of figure it out. So that's one of the reasons why Blender is like, low-key is the industry standard at this point. Like you see every concept artist use it. There's only a handful of people who use like Cinema 4D and Maya, and ZBrush is pretty common too, actually, mostly for character work. But at the end of the day, they all just bring it together and render their stuff in Blender. So yeah, that's what I mostly do too. All right, guys, so that should be all for today. I just wanted to make a quick video, just kind of like get back in track with YouTube. I mean, if you look at my channel, I have videos from like 2 years ago, maybe like a few from last year, and this time I feel like I want to be a little bit more consistent with this. So with this video is more like a rebirth for me and for my channel. So the good thing is that I've learned so much from so many amazing people in these past 2 years that I feel like I have more information to share with everyone, things that I learned through paid tutorials, from classes and things like that. And I feel like there's just so much information out there, but it's so expensive to get it. So I want to just share the things that I've learned, and I'm drawing either way, I'm building stuff in 3D either way. I might as well record it and post it, right? No one's getting hurt. But yeah, if you made it this far, please do subscribe to my channel, and I will be back in the next one.